You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we're just a day out from Judge Merchan imposing a gag order on Trump in his New York criminal trial, and he's been on a tear attacking Judge Merchan himself and his daughter. He did it yesterday, and now he's doing it again today. And I'll put the Truth Social post right up here on the screen to show Trump writing things like, "So let me get this straight. The judge's daughter is allowed to post pictures of her dream of putting me in jail. The Manhattan DA is able to say whatever lies about me he wants. The judge can violate our laws and constitution at every turn, but I'm not allowed to talk about the attacks against me and the lunatics trying to destroy my life and prevent me from winning the 2024 presidential election, which I am dominating." So, Glenn, Judge Merchan isn't included in this gag order, but does this raise the possibility that he will be?
Yeah, it's hard to understand why he made the gag order so narrow. I mean, at a minimum, I would have thought he would have included, for example, his family members, but he didn't include his family members in his first gag order. And now, lo and behold, we have Donald Trump calling out his daughter again, clearly putting his daughter in harm's way. But here's the thing, Brian, when you look at Donald Trump's latest rant, he doesn't violate the gag order. He names Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the district attorney and the judge. He throws Merrick Garland in there for good measure, even though he has nothing to do with the state court prosecution. But he actually doesn't violate the gag order. So, some people will say, well, Donald Trump can't control himself. It seems like he actually can. He chooses not to much of the time, but at least thus far, he hasn't violated the previous gag order. But it remains to be seen. Will Judge Merchan now modify the gag order? Will he expand it to include family members? I hope he does, because I think family members of judges, of court staff, of prosecutors should be out of bounds.
Now, I know this isn't a prediction show, but do you think it's likely, at a bare minimum, that Judge Merchan extends this order to protect at least his own daughter?
I don't see why he wouldn't. If we think to what Judge Engoron did, he issued a protective order, a gag order that covered his staff when Donald Trump was calling out and posting pictures of Judge Engoron's law clerk. I think the same should hold true for family members. So we'll keep an eye on Judge Merchan in the coming days, but it wouldn't surprise me if he expanded the gag order.
In terms of these judges not including themselves in the gag order, is that to convey some sense of, like, we don't want to seem too self-serving, we want to protect the defendant's right to be able to exercise, his First Amendment rights, even though, I mean, we've spoken about how your First Amendment rights are limited when you're a criminal defendant in a trial like this?
Yeah, I think we've seen the pattern emerge here where judges exclude themselves from the gag order. Judge Chutkan did it in Donald Trump's federal prosecution in D.C. Judge Engoron did not include himself in the gag order, and now Judge Merchan hasn't included himself in the gag order. And, I would say it makes some sense, but of course, it doesn't make sense for a criminal defendant to be able to criticize and say horrible things about a judge, because clearly that's not the defendant playing to his audience in a court of law. What is it? It's the defendant playing to his audience in the court of public opinion. He uses it to fundraise, but even more troublingly, I think he sends it out as a dog whistle to his troops. Anytime he names somebody, what do we see? We see the threats to that person ratchet up. So, I have, for quite some time now, been a Trump translator. Every time he posts the name of somebody, we know what he's saying. He is saying to his supporters, his MAGA base, get him, and they do.
Judge Merchan has thus far seemed very well prepared for all of the antics that Donald Trump is going to throw at him. Why didn't he seem to be as prepared for this right here?
Hard to understand why he didn't include family members. And there's really no explaining why he so narrowly tailored this gag order. I have to believe that he thought it would be bulletproof. It would be keeping within the law and keeping within kind of the expected risk that he knew Donald Trump presented. But again, if I am a prosecutor or a judge or involved in the criminal justice system, involved in the endeavor of trying to hold Donald Trump accountable for his crimes, and you start calling out and endangering my family members, boy, if I had the power, I would certainly expand the gag order to cover them.
Well, walk us through that process. If Judge Merchan does opt to protect his daughter from what will be these inevitable attacks by Trump and his supporters, what would the process look like if he were to go ahead and do that? Is he going to call Donald Trump back into the courtroom? Is he going to call like a snap hearing, basically?
He could do it one of two ways. He could simply issue an amended order saying, I am hereby amending my order of whatever yesterday's date was to include and expand it to include the following individuals. He could do that from chambers. He doesn't have to hold another hearing, although he could. He could say, I'm going to call the parties in on Friday. I am contemplating expanding the gag order, and I'm going to give the parties an opportunity to argue why I should or should not do that. But I have a feeling this would be an easy call, and this is just an amended order that he could issue from chambers.
Glenn, do you think that Trump is daring Judge Merchan to extend his gag order so that he can then cry victim and say, look, I'm being silenced even more than I was before?
Maybe. Of course, Donald Trump will always cry victim, even though he's not being victimized. Indeed, I maintain he's being treated better than most defendants similarly situated. Not that there's anybody quite so like Donald Trump. But, I continue to be shocked that we let Donald Trump endanger the lives of everybody engaged in the endeavor of trying to hold him accountable for his crimes, rather than ever holding Donald Trump accountable for his dangerous rhetoric, his reckless rhetoric, his violence-inducing rhetoric. I distinctly remember one of the judges during the oral argument in D.C., before the D.C. Federal Circuit Court of Appeals on the D.C. gag order. I remember Donald Trump's lawyer saying, hey, Donald Trump just posts things. He's not responsible for how his supporters react or respond. And the judge stopped them dead in his tracks and said, no, wait a minute. There is an established pattern here, and we all see it. Donald Trump posts somebody's name, and threats ensue. The problem is, Brian, for whatever reason, the institutions of government refuse to hold him accountable for the danger that he presents to everybody, even though he is he's a defendant on pretrial release in 4 felony cases. And the law provides if you're on release in a felony case and you present a danger to the community or even one person in the community, you are to be detained pending trial. None of the institutions of government have decided to step up and apply the law as it was directed to be applied. They'd rather sacrifice the safety of everybody else rather than apply the law in a common sense way to Donald Trump. I hope when this sad chapter is behind us and we see Donald Trump in our rearview mirror, hopefully sitting in a jail cell, we do an autopsy on what in the world has gone on here and how the institutions of government need to do better.
Well, speaking of those institutions, based on your 30 years of experience as a federal prosecutor, how does the system reconcile protecting a defendant's right to be able to speak, to exercise his First Amendment rights, with the fact that this particular defendant, in a raft of other trials, when he speaks, his supporters view that as a call to arms?
You can't divorce yourself from that reality, and the courts shouldn't try to. But thus far, as we say, they have declined to hold Trump accountable or really try to alter his behavior in any appreciable way. Even when he repeatedly violated the gag order that Judge Engoron had put in place, what did the judge do? He gave him what I think can only be called a very modest monetary fine, never stepped him back, never tried to hold him in contempt and jail him even for a day. That might actually make Donald Trump learn his lesson. Of course, it would also give him even more to scream and cry and complain about being a victim. But, my take on the collateral consequences of applying the rule of law to Donald Trump, when those collateral consequences might be more money will flow in from his supporters, or maybe he will attract more voters to his cause. None of that should matter, because once you start making legal decisions or prosecutorial decisions or judicial decisions based on those kind of collateral consequences, then you've lost. You should really just deal with Donald Trump by applying the facts and the law to his circumstances, his situation, and treat him the way you would treat anybody else. I know that sounds like folly in this day and age when nobody seems to be willing to treat Donald Trump the way any other criminal defendant would be treated. But, that is really what the equal application of the law is all about. I just wish some prosecutors and judges would step up and act accordingly.
And just to build on that, Donald Trump knows that, and he's able to abuse the system as the result of that. Because he knows that the judicial system will bend over backwards so as not to have the optics of mistreating him, because he knows he can get away with it, he'll then do it more and just try to get away with it even further. And so, this is how, abuse begets abuse for Donald Trump. And so if the law clamped down on him hard at the very beginning when it should have, instead of making all of these concessions for him and these loopholes and this special treatment, then he wouldn't be able to push the limits of what he can get away with. But because that's what's happening over and over and over again, up until this most recent time where, $455 million fraud verdict was whittled down to $175 million for bond purposes. Well, he just knows that he can keep pushing the limits of what he can get away with. And at the end of the day, the legal system does seem to bend to his will.
Yeah, we had a saying for that phenomenon in D.C. We call it feeding the monster. You don't feed the monster. You starve the monster. You don't reward bad behavior by turning a blind eye to it and not holding it accountable, because that's feeding the monster. All you're doing is encouraging and emboldening Donald Trump to continue to do what he's doing and ratchet up the dangerousness of his rhetoric. You don't feed the monster. You starve the monster by applying the rule of law aggressively but appropriately, the way we would to any other defendant.
Yeah, perfectly put. We'll leave it there. Obviously, we'll stay on top of any updates we get on the New York trial, which is going to begin jury selection on April 15th, as well as the other prosecutions Trump is contending with right now. So for those watching, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.